I always hated doing laundry, not because it was difficult, but because it reminded me of everything I did to keep the house running while Jack was away. Every folded towel and neatly stacked shirt felt like a silent testament to the life I'd built in his absence. A life filled with routines that didn't seem to matter to anyone but me. That night was no different. I'd spent the evening cleaning up after dinner, wiping down the counters, and tidying up the living room before finally tackling the overflowing laundry basket. Jack had been gone for nearly 2 weeks on one of his endless business trips, leaving me alone in the house with Caleb, his 24-year-old son. I barely noticed Caleb most days. He kept to himself, spending hours in the garage or on his computer. But his presence was still a comfort, a reminder that the house wasn't entirely empty. As I carried the basket toward the bedroom, the sound of running water stopped me. It wasn't unusual for Caleb to take late showers after working in the garage, but something about the sound caught my attention. The water wasn't running steadily. Instead, it came in uneven bursts, like it was being turned on and off. I paused, listening more closely. Beneath the sound of the shower, I heard something else. A soft, rhythmic thudding, muffled but distinct. It sounded like rubber tapping against tile. Thud, thud, thud. The noise wasn't loud, but it was steady enough to stand out, its rhythm oddly in sync with the stuttering water. "Caleb?" I called, setting the basket down in the hallway. No answer. I frowned and moved toward the bathroom. The door was slightly ajar, and a thin line of yellow light spilled out into the darkened hall. The sound grew clearer as I approached, each muted thud sending a strange ripple of unease through me. I couldn't explain it, but the combination of the uneven water and the rhythmic tapping made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. "Caleb," I called again, louder this time. Still no response. I hesitated just outside the door. My hand hovered over the frame, torn between knocking and simply stepping back. The sound of the water shifted again, its uneven bursts filling the silence. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. I leaned forward, peering through the crack in the door. The sliver of light revealed only part of the bathroom, pale tiles, steam clinging to the mirror, and Caleb's broad shoulders. He was hunched over slightly, his back to me. His arms moved rhythmically, but I couldn't tell what he was doing. My breath caught in my throat as I watched him, unsure whether to call out again or turn back. Something about the way his body moved felt strange. Deliberate, almost mechanical. His shoulders tensed with each motion, his head bowed slightly as if he were concentrating. "Caleb," I said once more, my voice faltering. His movement stilled. The rhythmic tapping stopped, leaving only the sound of water dripping unevenly from the shower head. For a moment, he didn't turn around. I stood frozen in the hallway, my heart pounding in the silence. The pause stretched longer than it should have. Caleb still hadn't turned around. He stood there frozen, as if deciding whether to acknowledge me or not. The water from the shower head splattered unevenly against the tiles, the sound filling the silence between us. "Caleb," I repeated, this time with a little more force. Slowly, he straightened up. I couldn't see his face, only the broad line of his back as steam curled around his figure. His head tilted slightly, just enough to suggest he'd heard me but wasn't in any hurry to respond. His expression was calm, almost unreadable. "I was distracted," he said simply, his voice low. "Sorry about that." "Distracted? By what?" I wanted to ask but held my tongue. Instead, I nodded awkwardly and forced a thin smile. I didn't mean to interrupt. I heard something strange. It sounded like tapping. For a moment, his eyes flicked toward the floor, then back to me. "Probably the pipes," he said after a pause, his tone casual. "The shower's been acting up." "Right?" I said, swallowing hard. "The shower." He didn't offer anything more, and the air between us grew heavy. I felt foolish for standing there, staring at him like I was waiting for some grand explanation. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overreacting, letting my imagination run wild. But something about the way he was looking at me, so calm and steady, sent a shiver down my spine. "Well, I'll let you get back to it," I said finally, taking a step back. Caleb nodded once, turning his attention back to the tub. His movements were slower this time, almost deliberate, as he reached for the shower knob to turn off the water. I didn't wait to see what he was doing next. I stepped into the hallway, closing the door behind me. As I picked up the laundry basket and headed to the bedroom, my mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. What had I walked in on? Why hadn't he heard me calling him? And why did the sound of that tapping still echo in my ears even now that it was gone? I tried to shake the strange feeling as I folded the rest of the laundry, telling myself it was nothing. Caleb was an adult. He didn't owe me an explanation for every little thing he did. Besides, I had more important things to worry about, like the fact that Jack's trip had been extended another week, leaving me to fend for myself in this too-quiet house. But as I crawled into bed that night, the unease lingered. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the faint creaks and groans of the house settling around me. My mind replayed the scene in the bathroom over and over again, each detail magnified in the darkness. The sound of the water, the rhythmic tapping, the way Caleb had hesitated before turning around. It all felt wrong. Not threatening exactly, but strange enough to make me question if I'd missed something important. I rolled onto my side, pulling the blanket up to my chin as my thoughts spiraled. Jack would know what to do, I thought. He'd laugh it off, tell me I was being silly, and remind me that Caleb was a good kid who just kept to himself. But Jack wasn't here. And as the night stretched on, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something had changed. The next morning, I woke early, still restless from a fitful night of sleep. Caleb was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, sipping coffee at the counter with his phone in hand. He glanced up when I walked in, offering a faint smile. "Morning," he said, his tone easy, as if nothing unusual had happened the night before. "Morning," I replied, pouring myself a cup of coffee. For a while, we sat in companionable silence. I tried to focus on the newspaper spread out in front of me, but my eyes kept drifting toward Caleb. He seemed perfectly normal, scrolling through his phone and sipping his coffee like any other day. "You slept okay?" "Okay," he asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. I hesitated, startled by the question. Yeah." I lied. "You, like a rock," he said with a small laugh. There was nothing wrong with his tone or his expression, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his words than met the eye. I forced a smile and returned my attention to the newspaper, though the words on the page blurred together as my mind wandered. As the day went on, I tried to push the whole thing out of my mind. I busied myself with cleaning, errands, and catching up on emails, anything to keep my thoughts occupied. But every time I passed the bathroom, or caught a glimpse of Caleb in the garage, the unease came rushing back. What was wrong with me? I wasn't usually this paranoid. Caleb had always been kind and respectful, never giving me a reason to doubt him. But the strange tension from the night before refused to fade. By the time evening rolled around, I was exhausted from overthinking. I sat on the couch with a glass of wine, hoping it would help me unwind. But the quiet of the house only amplified my restless thoughts. Caleb was in his room, the faint hum of his music leaking through the walls, and for a moment, I considered going to talk to him. But what would I even say? That I was feeling uncomfortable for no reason. That I couldn't stop thinking about something as insignificant as a noise in the bathroom? It sounded ridiculous, even in my head. The next few days passed in a haze of normalcy, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling that had taken root in me. Caleb continued about his usual routines, working in the garage, running errands, and occasionally joining me for dinner. He was polite, helpful even, but I started to notice small things I might have overlooked before. His glances lingered just a second too long. His casual compliments felt a bit more deliberate. And every time we crossed paths in the hallway or kitchen, the air seemed heavier, charged with something I couldn't name. I told myself I was imagining things. Jack's absence was messing with my head, making me see problems where there were none. Caleb was a good kid, quiet, respectful, and independent. There was no reason to suspect anything, but that didn't stop the unease from growing. It was late afternoon when Caleb appeared in the living room, a towel slung over his shoulder and a smudge of grease on his cheek. He'd been working on something in the garage all morning, the faint sound of metal tools clanging against each other echoing through the house. "Hey, Claire," he said, his tone casual. "Can you give me a hand with something? It's a two-person job." He hesitated, caught off guard by the request. Caleb rarely asked for help, preferring to handle things on his own. "What is it?" I asked, setting down the book I'd been pretending to read. "Just need someone to hold something steady while I tighten a bolt," he said with a small shrug. A half-assembled piece of equipment sat on his workbench, surrounded by scattered tools and a few crumpled rags. "Here," he said, handing me a small bracket. "Just hold it in place while I secure it." I did as he asked, trying to focus on the task at hand, instead of the way his arms brushed mine as he worked. The space between us felt smaller than it should have, his presence unnervingly close. "Thanks," he said after a moment, stepping back and wiping his hands on his jeans. "Couldn't have done it without you." "It's no problem," I replied quickly, setting the bracket down and stepping away. He smiled at me, but there was something in his expression that made my skin prickle. I left the garage as quickly as I could, my heart pounding for reasons I couldn't explain. That night, Caleb joined me for dinner, a rare occurrence given how often he preferred eating alone in his room. We sat at opposite ends of the table, the clinking of silverware the only sound in the room. "Good chicken," he said after a while, his voice cutting through the silence. "Thanks," I replied, offering a small smile. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on me in a way that made me feel exposed. "You don't have to do all this, you know," he said, gesturing to the neatly set table and the food. "I like to cook," I said simply, though the truth was that it gave me something to focus on, something to fill the quiet hours while Jack was away. He nodded, his gaze unwavering. "You take care of everything around here. Dad's lucky to have you." The comment was innocent enough, but the way he said it made my chest tighten. I forced a laugh, trying to lighten the mood. "Well, someone has to keep things running. If it were me," he said softly, his tone almost wistful, "I'd make sure you didn't have to do it all alone." The words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. I looked at him, unsure how to respond, but he didn't elaborate. Instead, he stood up, taking his plate to the sink and rinsing it off before heading upstairs. I sat there for a long time after he left, staring at the empty table and wondering what, exactly, he'd meant. It was past midnight when I woke to the sound of something faint. A creak, like a floorboard shifting under weight. For a moment, I thought it was my imagination, the result of a restless mind that refused to let go of its worries. But then I heard it again, louder this time. I sat up in bed, my heart racing as I strained to listen. The house was dark and silent except for the faint hum of a refrigerator and the occasional groan of the old pipes. Then came another sound, a soft shuffle, like footsteps moving down the hallway. I slipped out of bed, my feet silent against the carpet as I moved toward the door. I opened it just a crack, enough to see the faint glow of a light spilling from under Caleb's door. The sound of footsteps stopped, replaced by the low murmur of his voice. Was he on the phone? Talking to someone? I leaned closer, trying to make out what he was saying, but his words were too muffled to understand. Alharmi wanted to knock, to ask if everything was okay, but something held me back. Instead, I retreated to my room, closing the door quietly behind me. I crawled back into bed, my mind spinning with questions. What was Caleb doing up so late? And why did I feel like I didn't want to know the answer? The days after that restless night blurred together, but the unease that had taken hold of me only grew stronger. I couldn't pinpoint exactly what was wrong, but something about Caleb's behavior was shifting in ways I couldn't ignore. It was in the small moments, the way he lingered in the kitchen after dinner, watching me with an intensity that felt like it carried more weight than his casual demeanor suggested. The way he seemed to find reasons to be near me, always just on the edge of my personal space, as if testing an invisible boundary. I tried to brush it off as paranoia. Jack's absence left a void in the house that I was projecting onto Caleb. Or so I told myself. He was just being helpful, I reasoned. Polite, considerate. Nothing more. But deep down, I wasn't convinced. One evening, I was folding towels in the laundry room when I heard Caleb's voice, low and steady, coming from the hallway. He was on the phone. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but his words carried clearly in the quiet house. Yeah, he was saying, it's been fine, just the two of us here. A pause. No, she's good. Better than I expected. My hands froze over the towel I was folding. I leaned closer to the door, straining to hear more. Yeah, I'm taking care of things. She appreciates it. I think she's starting to see. He trailed off as footsteps approached. I stepped back quickly, pretending to sort the towels as he walked past the door. He glanced inside, his expression neutral, but there was something about the way his eyes lingered on me that made my heart race. Need any help? He asked casually, leaning against the doorframe. No, I've got it, I replied quickly, folding the towel with more force than necessary. He nodded, his gaze steady. Let me know if you do. As he turned and walked away, I let out a shaky breath, the tension in my chest refusing to ease. The next night, the sound of footsteps woke me again. This time, I stayed in bed, listening as they moved down the hall. There was no light under Caleb's door, but I could hear him, soft, deliberate movements that made the floor creak just enough to be noticeable. I sat up, debating whether to investigate or let it go. Every instinct in me screamed to stay where I was, to leave it alone. But curiosity, or maybe something deeper, pushed me to my feet. I opened my door just enough to peek into the hallway. It was dark, except for the faint glow of the kitchen light spilling into the corridor. The footsteps had stopped, replaced by the low sound of running water. I hesitated, my pulse quickening. For a moment, I thought about retreating to my room and locking the door, but instead, I moved toward the kitchen. When I rounded the corner, I froze. Caleb was standing at the sink, his back to me, washing something under the faucet. His movements were slow and deliberate, his shoulders hunched slightly as he worked. Caleb, I said, my voice breaking the silence. He stiffened, his hands stilling under the water. For a long moment, he didn't turn around. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but low. Couldn't sleep, me neither, I replied, though my voice sounded weak even to my own ears. What are you doing? Just cleaning up, he said, glancing over his shoulder. His face was partially in shadow, but his expression was unreadable. I stepped closer, trying to see what he was holding, but he moved slightly, blocking my view. It's late, I said, feeling foolish for stating the obvious. Maybe you should try to get some rest. Yeah, he said quietly, turning off the water and drying his hands on a dish towel. You too. As he walked past me, I caught a faint scent of oil and metal, a reminder of the hours he spent working in the garage. He didn't say goodnight, and I stood there for a long time, staring at the sink and wondering what exactly he'd been washing. The next morning, Caleb was unusually quiet. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at his coffee without touching it. I wanted to ask him about the night before, but the words wouldn't come. You okay? I asked finally, breaking the silence. He looked up at me, his expression distant. Yeah, just tired. He nodded, though the tightness in my chest didn't ease. As I went about my day, the memory of him standing at the sink lingered in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was building, a tension that neither of us was willing to acknowledge. The following days were a strange dance of avoidance and proximity. Caleb and I rarely spoke beyond the necessary pleasantries, but I could feel his presence everywhere. It wasn't just his physical nearness. It was the subtle tension in the air, the way his movements seemed to echo louder in the quiet house, the way his gaze lingered a moment too long when we crossed paths. I busied myself with chores, errands, and anything else that could fill the silence. Yet, the unease refused to leave. At night, I lay awake in bed, listening for the faint creaks of footsteps in the hallway, the soft hum of water running in the bathroom. or the clink of something metallic in the kitchen. The sound of the late-night cleaning replayed in my mind over and over. I couldn't stop imagining Caleb's hunched figure at the sink, the deliberate movements of his hands. What had he been washing? Why had he seemed so guarded when I found him? I told myself it was nothing. I told myself to let it go. But the questions lingered, and with Jack still weeks away from returning, I had no one to confide in. It was a gray afternoon when the tension finally broke. I was in the garden, pulling weeds from the flower bed Jack had promised to fix before leaving on his trip. The air was cool, the sky heavy with clouds, and I found solace in the simple, repetitive task of digging into the earth. I didn't hear Caleb approach until he was right behind me. "Need some help?" he asked, his voice startling me. I turned, brushing the dirt from my gloves. "I think I've got it," I said, forcing a smile. He crouched beside me anyway, plucking a stray weed from the soil. For a moment, we worked in silence, the only sound the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. "You spend a lot of time out here," he said finally, his tone casual. "It's peaceful," I replied, focusing on the soil. "Peaceful." He repeated the word as if tasting it. "You get lonely?" The question caught me off guard. I glanced at him, but his expression was neutral, his attention on the weeds. "Everyone gets lonely sometimes," I said carefully. He nodded, pulling another weed. "Yeah, I get that." There was something in his voice, a weight that made my chest tighten. I kept my focus on the garden, refusing to let my thoughts spiral. "Dad's gone a lot," he said after a moment. "More than most people would be okay with." I froze, the words hanging in the air between us. "It's his job," I said quietly. "He works hard to take care of us." "I know," Caleb said, his tone softening. "But still, it can't be easy." I didn't know how to respond. The truth was, he wasn't wrong. Jack's long absences left a void that was hard to fill. But hearing Caleb voice it so plainly felt like a line being crossed, a conversation we shouldn't be having. "I manage," I said finally, standing and brushing the dirt from my knees. "Thank you for the help, but I think I'm done for now." Caleb stood too, watching me for a moment before nodding. "Anytime?" he said, his voice quiet. As I walked back into the house, I felt his gaze on me, and a shiver ran down my spine. Later that evening, as I was tidying the living room, I found a plain white envelope tucked under the edge of the couch. At first, I thought it was junk mail or something Jack had left behind, but when I picked it up, I realized it was unmarked. Curious, I opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded neatly in half. My heart began to race as I unfolded it, unsure of what I was expecting. The note was brief, written in a clean, precise hand. "You deserve to feel seen." My hands shook as I reread the words, my mind racing. Who had written it? Caleb. It had to be Caleb. But why? What was he trying to say? I crumpled the note in my hand, my chest tightening with a mix of anger and fear. This had gone too far. I needed to say something, to confront him, to put a stop to whatever this was. But as I stood there, clutching the note, the words caught in my throat. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the crumpled note hidden in the drawer of my nightstand. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing, just a moment of poor judgment or a misunderstanding. But the weight of Caleb's presence in the house felt suffocating. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again, the faint creak of footsteps in the hallway. I sat up, my heart pounding. The footsteps stopped outside my door, and I held my breath, waiting, listening. The handle turned slightly, the soft click of the latch barely audible. My pulse raced, and for a moment I thought the door would open. But then the footsteps moved on, retreating down the hallway toward the stairs. I waited until the sound faded completely before slipping out of bed. My hands trembled as I reached for the door, opening it just enough to peek into the hallway. The house was dark and silent, but a faint glow came from downstairs. I crept toward the stairs, the wood cold under my bare feet, and peered into the kitchen. Caleb was there, standing by the counter, his back to me. He wasn't moving, just standing still, his head bowed slightly. "Caleb?" I called softly, my voice barely above a whisper. He turned slowly, his face partially obscured by shadow. For a long moment, we just stared at each other, the silence between us heavy and charged. "I didn't mean to wake you," he said finally, his voice low. "You didn't," I lied, stepping closer. "Is everything okay?" He nodded, though his expression was hard to read. "Yeah, just couldn't sleep." I wanted to press him, to ask why he'd been outside my door, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I nodded, forcing a weak smile. "Try to get some rest," I said, turning to head back upstairs. "Claire," he said suddenly, stopping me in my tracks. I turned back to him, my chest tight. "You deserve to feel seen," he said softly, his eyes locked on mine. My breath caught, and for a moment, I couldn't move. His words hung in the air, echoing the note I'd found earlier. Without another word, I turned and walked upstairs, my heart pounding as I closed the door behind me. The next morning, I woke up feeling as though the weight of the previous night was pressing down on my chest. Caleb's words echoed in my mind. "You deserve to feel seen." I spent most of the day trying to avoid him, retreating to the garden, the laundry room, anywhere I could stay out of his orbit. But the house was only so big, and by mid-afternoon, I found myself in the kitchen, preparing dinner. The clatter of pots and the hiss of the stovetop filled the silence, but I still felt him before I saw him. "Need help?" Caleb's voice was soft, but carried a deliberate weight, like it wasn't really a question. I didn't turn to face him. "I'm fine," I said curtly, focusing on chopping vegetables. He lingered, leaning against the counter. I could feel his eyes on me, and the tension in the room was almost suffocating. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Why did you say that last night?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "Say what?" he replied, though I knew he understood. I turned to face him, the knife still in my hand. "Don't play games with me, Caleb. You know what I'm talking about." His expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Guilt, maybe, or defiance. "I just said what I thought you needed to hear." I stared at him, struggling to find the words. "That's not your place. Do you understand that? You're crossing a line, am I?" he asked, stepping closer. His tone wasn't aggressive, but there was an edge to it that made my heart race. "Maybe someone needs to. He's gone all the time, Claire. He doesn't see you, but I do." "Stop," I said, taking a step back. "This isn't appropriate, Caleb. You're my stepson, and you're my stepmother," he said, his voice softening but his gaze still locked on mine. "But that doesn't mean I don't care about you. Doesn't mean I don't notice how lonely you are." I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "You don't know anything about my life," I said, my voice trembling. "I know enough," he replied, stepping even closer. "I know you deserve more than being alone all the time, waiting for someone who's never here." I snapped, the knife clattering onto the counter as I stepped away from him. My chest was heaving, and I could feel the sting of tears in my eyes. "You need to stop this, right now." For a moment, Caleb looked stunned, as if he hadn't expected me to raise my voice. Then his face hardened and he nodded slowly. "Okay," he said quietly. "If that's what you want." He turned and left the kitchen without another word, leaving me standing there, trembling with a mix of anger, fear, and something I couldn't quite name. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I needed to tell Jack. I needed to call him and explain everything, no matter how uncomfortable the conversation would be. But every time I picked up my phone, my fingers hovered over the screen, unable to dial. What would I even say? That his son had overstepped in ways I couldn't ignore? That I wasn't sure if I'd done something to invite it? The thought made me feel sick. By morning, I had resolved to wait until Jack came home. I couldn't handle this over the phone. I needed him here, in person, to see the situation for himself. The final confrontation came 2 days later. I was in the living room sorting through a stack of mail when Caleb walked in. His movements were deliberate, his expression calm but unreadable. "We need to talk," he said. I didn't look up. "I don't think we do." "I think we do," he said, his tone firm but quiet. I set the mail down, my hands trembling. "There's nothing to talk about, Caleb. You said what you needed to say, and I made it clear where I stand." "Did you?" he asked, stepping closer. "Because it doesn't feel that way." I stood, trying to put distance between us. "This isn't a discussion. Whatever you think is happening here, it's not. Do you understand me?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he might argue. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he might argue. But then he nodded, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Fine," he said, his voice low. "I'll go." "Go where?" I asked, caught off guard. "Out," he replied simply. "I'll stay with a friend until Dad gets back." "Maybe that's what you want, right?" The guilt hit me like a punch to the stomach. "Caleb, that's not—" "It's fine," he interrupted, his tone sharper now. "I get it. You don't have to explain." Turned and walked out of the room, leaving me standing there, unsure whether to feel relieved or devastated. Caleb left that evening, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He didn't say goodbye, and I didn't try to stop him. The house felt impossibly quiet after he was gone, but the tension that had filled every corner seemed to evaporate. When Jack came home a week later, I told him everything. The conversation was messy, filled with tears and accusations, but in the end, he believed me. "I'll talk to him," Jack said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "I'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Caleb didn't return to the house. Jack visited him a few times, but I never asked what they talked about. I didn't want to know. In the months that followed, things between Jack and me slowly returned to normal. But the scars remained, a silent reminder of how easily trust could be broken, even within the confines of family. It's been 2 years since Caleb left. Jack and I have rebuilt our life, though his work trips are shorter now, and he calls more often. We never talk about what happened. Sometimes, late at night, I think about Caleb and wonder what might have been different if Jack had been home more often, if I had been braver, if things hadn't spiraled the way they did. But those thoughts don't last long. I've learned to let them go, to focus on the present and the life I've built, because some truths I've realized are better left in the past.